Now, similar to the masculinity halaqah, we'll also discuss a little bit about the preliminary background of femininity. We'll discuss how, for example, development used to take place in the past versus how it takes place now. Femininity is also from one of the most fundamental knowledge related to our existence, or the existence of the women of this ummah. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them in a step-by-step manner, just like He created us in a step-by-step manner. We have a particular progression in life, and each step in that progress in life has its own challenges that we have to deal with. It is this knowledge of masculinity and this knowledge of femininity that teaches us even the most fundamental truths about what is expected of us when we're in our infancy to when we're in our teenage years. And then we enter into our 20s and 30s, we enter into the workforce and we start our own businesses, we gain resources and so on and so forth, until we get married, we establish our own families, and then in our 40s and 50s and 60s, we continue to build for the next generation to come. This is the same progress or the same steps that are taken by women as well. Now in the past, the development of a girl into a woman used to be a very consistent and tried and tested way, basically, where a girl would be within the confines of her home, in the comfort and the security of her home, with her family, especially her mother and her siblings, especially her sisters. And naturally, societies and communities were very close-knit. So one family of women were regularly interacting with other close-knitted, trustworthy women in a particular circle. And this is where they would learn the ways of how and how they can basically develop into the role of a future wife, a future mother, and so on and so forth. They would see and emulate their own mothers, their own elder sisters, aunts, and so on and so forth. But the main focus was to basically develop inside the comfort and security of the home. And this lasted for millennia, all the way until essentially the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, when you had, for the first time in human history, a systemic path for women to enter into the workforce. And that happened in the First World War. The First World War was when millions of men in North America and in Europe were busy fighting in their war, and there was a genuine need, according to their own military campaigns, to provide armaments, to provide military support, equipment. All of that had to be done for the first time in history by bringing a large portion of women into the workforce. Okay? Until then, there were women, no doubt, in the workforce. They were working in the fields, in businesses, and so on and so forth, but it was never a norm at all until the First World War. And after that happened, the state, as you can imagine, for the first time saw an opportunity for bringing 50% of the whole of Earth into the workforce, because they're the ones who are the beneficiaries of taxes. For the first time in human history, they saw an opportunity to collect taxes from 50% of the population of humanity that was previously sitting in homes and developing their homes and their families. So the state started to actively, post First World War, come up with a way to reform society and to rebuild it in such a way that facilitates many aspects. The aspect that is relevant to us today is that women are no longer meant to be in the home, they're actually meant to be functionally equal with men. This was the first time that it happened, fueling their creed, the creed of individualism, the creed of capitalism. All of these ideological points that structured the societies in the West and in basically North America and Europe, all of that was being put to use now. You can see certain policies and certain ways being shifted to accommodate these ideas. Okay? And at the same time came another social revolution, starting within or emanating within the West, where you had rich, prominent Caucasian, mainly Caucasian white women, who for centuries had been experiencing oppression in the West, being treated like property for millennia in the West, that wanted to organize a social movement, and this is the movement of feminism. That also happened around the same time as well. And feminism basically began, just as a quick background, because inshallah we'll do a separate halaqah on just feminism, because this is an ideology that needs to be broken down in detail and refuted. So we'll have a dedicated lecture towards it, but in a very quick, concise way to go over it. Feminism effectively began, like I said, from a small group of Caucasian white women who wanted to basically have some form of equality with men. And the first wave of feminism that began in the mid-1800s, all the way until basically the early 1900s, 1902, 1903 roughly, is considered to be the first wave of feminism, where certain rights that were absolutely fundamental to the Western society were now desired by women as well. And that included the right of voting, suffrage. Okay, so it began as a very innocent movement where a lot of oppression that was experienced by the Western woman throughout millennia had to be basically put to end. However, after the advent of women coming into the workforce in a systemic manner, came the second wave of feminism. And that basically started from around 1940s, 1950s, roughly. And this basically called for a complete reevaluation of gender roles. What we consider to be traditional gender roles was now being shifted completely, because now there's a few decades that had passed with women also earning money. So now there was a natural shift. Instead of having a single breadwinner that came and that worked outside, brought in money, and then made the decisions in the home in a hierarchical leadership structure that lasted or that has been on this earth for millennia. All of that was now shifting in the Western world. And this was the time when there was a lot of propaganda being done. A lot of propaganda in Western magazines, especially the magazines like 𝗪𝗵𝗿𝗲. How many of you guys heard of that particular magazine? These magazines were systematically being used as propaganda. There are actually authors today after decades, who have written books where they're now exposing certain truths that when we used to work with 𝗪𝗵𝗿𝗲 and other magazines back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, they were told to write certain truths or basically lies that were posing as truths in order to basically glamorize this idea of the working woman, that being at home with your family and raising children and so on and so forth is something that is backward. That's something that old women did, oppressed women did. This was active propaganda that was being done in that particular set of decades, until basically all of this continued to intensify, and the third wave of feminism started to come out in the 1990s. And this was where there was an active hatred for any kind of male leadership hierarchy. And this is something that is very antithetical to a healthy home. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the home as an institution. And like any other institution, there are associates. And then above those associates, there's a singular leader in order to have some form of unity. All of that was now being challenged in a very serious, both from an economic and also social and political manner. There were lots of policies that were being implemented and laws that were changing to facilitate this hatred for quote-unquote patriarchy. And this was also at the time when you saw a lot of other factions of women. So black women, Muslim women, trans women, and so on and so forth. All of these little demographics that were there, all of them also wanted their own form of equality as well. So many different types of feminism also started to emerge in those particular decades. This is basically known as intersectionality. in sociology. And then you also had leading to basically the 2010s. So now we're basically getting to a very recent times when you had the fourth wave of feminism. Fourth wave of feminism is basically when this intersectionality also intensified even more so. And with the use of social media, now you had an almost vigilante form of justice, social justice that was being fought by the feminist movement, where it was no longer about even equality at a functional level. It was now actually about supremacy. There was actual policies being made that favored women at the expense of the men. And this is basically where we are right now. So tons and tons of trials and tribulations that we're facing socially within this particular circle. Which is why femininity and understanding womanhood from the lens of the Quran and the Sunnah is absolutely essential. Because the impact of individualism, the impact of capitalism, the impact of the feminist movement, all of these isms is wreaking absolute havoc. To the extent that in the West, the family institution is nearly broken. Now you have a very intense form of individualist societal norms that are being established. And that's what we're trying to avoid. This is exactly what the state actually desired in the past. One of the founders of a very prominent feminist magazine, it's called the Miss Magazine. How many of you guys have heard of that? Miss Magazine. Miss Magazine was actually a feminist magazine that was founded in the 70s by a feminist leader named Gloria Steinem. Gloria Steinem actually, in recent times, admitted fully from her own accord, from her own account, that they were funded, that whole magazine and that initiative was funded by the American government, by the CIA in particular. It's amazing to think that what does the CIA have to do with a social movement and the funding of a magazine? But no, this is something that is systemic. This is a systematic approach to divide men and women. Because this is the oldest trick in the book, divide and conquer. Divide and conquer and basically remove any kind of boundaries between two groups of people so that everything's blurry. Nobody knows where they belong. And that's what we see today. Even the concept of gender is something that is in the air. Today you have even an intensified form of intersectionality, where if you ask especially the radical feminists, what is a woman? Ask them the question, what is a woman? And they will have a difficult time defining it. Because they're restructuring every axiomatic definition that ever existed. Anything that was self-evident. Something like gender was never questioned in human history until now. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, subhanAllah, you can see the timeless nature of the Quran. Out of all of the self-evident truths, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it clear in the Quran, وَلَيْسَ الذَّكَرُ كَالْأُنْثَى, that the male is not like the female. Men and women are demarcated as separate genders. They have their unique identity. They have their unique complementary functions that they bring in. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Layl beautifully, وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَى وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا تَجَلَّى وَمَا خَلَقَ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنْثَى إِنَّ سَعْيَكُمْ لَشَتَّى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says by the night, He swears by the night, that the night, that which covers, and by the day which illuminates and appears out in the open, and by the fact that He created the male and the female with their distinct functions, with their complementary functions. They have different roles to play. And this is exactly what was made blurry. Hence why we're doing these halaqat. Inshallah, when we discuss femininity, we'll basically group all of the qualities together because of time into three broad buckets. Now, all of these three broad categories of qualities of femininity are going to be discussed in light of two major hadith. two major narrations of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The first of those narrations is the hadith of Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhu, who said that the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the best of the women among the people of paradise are four. Now, who knows this famous narration that I'm sure everybody knows? Who can remind me who are those four women mentioned in this particular hadith? Amazing. Four of the best women that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself mentions: Khadija, Fatima, Maryam, and Asiya. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with all of them. So the first narration, basically we want to extract what made them good, what made them the best. We want to extract the qualities from this particular hadith. And then the second hadith that we will basically look at all of the qualities in light of is the famous hadith of Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, who said that the Messenger says sallallahu alaihi wasallam that if a woman prays her 5 prayers and she fasts her Ramadan and she guards her chastity and she obeys her husband, that woman will be called by all of the gates of paradise to enter from, and she'll be allowed to enter whichever gate that she wishes to enter from. These are the two narrations that we'll discuss the qualities, or extract the qualities out of. The first broad quality is of true femininity and womanhood is piety to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because without piety there's nothing. Without piety, without being sincere to the one who created you, how can you possibly be sincere to yourself or to other people around you? Impossible. So the first and the main foundation of femininity, similar to masculinity as well, is piety to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, who can define piety in a very quick way? We've discussed this several times in the past halaqat. Who can define what is piety? Taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does it mean? Okay, sincerity, belief in the hereafter. Who else wants to add to that? Fear of Allah, consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. What else? Anybody from the sisters? The definition of taqwa. Staying away from the bad, from the haram, and protecting yourself. Beautiful. All of these are definitions that can be put under the umbrella of taqwa. Taqwa basically, linguistically, comes from wiqaya, which basically means to shield. You're shielding yourself from the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by acting and obeying in accordance with His standards, with His commands. This is basically what taqwa is. And conceptually, the best and the most amazing definition that can be given to conceptualize taqwa is when Umar bin Khattab asked the companion Ubay ibn Ka'b radiyallahu anhu, what is the definition of taqwa? And Ubay asked Umar, have you ever walked on a path that has thorns in it? That has a bush with a lot of thorns in it? Umar said, yes, of course I have. So he asked him, how did you walk in it? He said, I walked in it in such a way that I brought all of the clothes that I was wearing close to myself. And I was very careful so the thorns don't basically get stuck in my clothes, or they don't prick my skin and cause damage. This is basically how Ubay ibn Ka'b defined taqwa. Walking through life in such a way that it protects you from the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So every action you do, you want to understand how best to do it in order to gain the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to avoid the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first step to actually attaining piety is, and we've discussed this several times as well in the past, is to seek knowledge. Al-ilmu qabla al-qawli wal-amal. As Imam al-Bukhari basically names this chapter in his Sahih, that knowledge comes before speech and actions. Worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala must be based on knowledge. And that's why, as we've said in the past, the likes of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the famous Imam, he mentioned that the need of knowledge for the slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, both males and females, is more pertinent, more important than even food and water. Food and water, we basically eat and drink a couple of times a day, and we can survive. But knowledge you need at every single breath. You need to know how to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and how to avoid the haram in every aspect of your life. So this is the first aspect in attaining piety to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is something that the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has obligated. طلب العلم فريضة على كل مسلم أو مسلمة. The Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam made it clear that even for the male and the female believers, it is obligatory to seek knowledge. And that's why the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam actually had a day in the week dedicated to teaching the women among the Sahaba, the Sahabiyat. He specifically had a day in the week where there was a halaqah that was given to the women in the masjid for them to learn the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is something that the ulama have written books in the past. Like for example, the famous scholar Ibn al-Jawzi, the Hanbali scholar, who died 597 after Hijrah. He wrote a book called Ahkam al-Nisa, the rulings pertaining to women. And he wrote that book specifically during his time because he saw this as a problem. He saw a fundamental lack of Islamic knowledge among the women of his time. So he actually wrote a book to address this. And he mentioned in his book, Ahkam al-Nisa, he says that how can we possibly have a healthy society in which you have women who don't have knowledge, or especially of the deen? Because it is them, they're the ones who are basically teaching their children. If you want to see the next generation and how they are, it will be in direct proportion to how much of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala they know and they're able to convey. And that's why in the lecture that we did on the rights of the husband and the wife, we mentioned this, that the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created these complementary roles between the genders is so that the man can basically worry about the provisions outside of the house, so that she can dedicate herself inside of the house to prepare the next generation of this ummah. And subhanAllah, you see the result of piety. You see the result of having principles that women can basically either adhere to or not. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Tahrim, He mentions examples for the women of this ummah until the day of judgment of two types of women. The first one is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ضرب الله مثلا للذين كفروا امرأة نوح وامرأة لوط. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given a parable of those who disbelieved among the wife of Nuh and the wife of Lut. Both of them, both of their wives, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made them an example of what happens to a woman who disbelieves, who is exactly the opposite of a pious woman. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that they were under two of our righteous slaves, meaning Lut and Nuh. They're the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But they betrayed them, both of them. And the betrayal, basically, as the Mufassirin mentioned, is the fact that they did not believe in the message that was given to them by the messengers, their own husbands. So those prophets did not avail them at all. They could not even benefit from the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when it was in their own home. And it was said to them, enter the fire with those who enter. قِيلَ دُخُلَ النَّارَ مَعَ الدَّاخِلِينَ. This is the abode, this is the result of the ones who are not pious. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made these two women who disbelieved as an example for the rest, for us to take heed from until the day of judgment. But then He also gave the example of the exact opposite. وَضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِمْرَأَةَ فِرْعَوْنَ. And among the parables that He has given, an example of those who believed as the wife of Fir'aun, Asiyah bint Muzahim. This woman basically, in the house of Fir'aun, the one who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made an example of evil in the Quran, maintained her piety, maintained her truthfulness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala despite having the worst of environments. And she also ended up raising one of the greatest of the Anbiya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Musa alayhi salam. And because of this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made this woman an example for every single believer to follow until the day of judgment, where she asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to place her in a house close to him. Subhanallah. This was basically the request that this woman had. These are the examples that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places for the believers to learn from. And then similarly, you have other examples, like we mentioned in the hadith of the four greatest women. You have Khadija radiallahu anha. Khadija radiallahu anha supported the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam from day one. This woman never left his side from day one. She came from a background that gave her essentially a lot of wealth, because she had two prior husbands, both of them had passed away. So she inherited wealth from two deceased husbands in the past. So she had a lot of wealth basically. All of that wealth she spent in the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She spent it in the cause of supporting her husband sallallahu alayhi wasallam in spreading the truth of Islam. To the extent that you have a hadith of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam narrated by Bukhari and Muslim from the companion Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, who said that Jibreel came to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam once when he was alone. And he came to him and told him that Khadija radiallahu anha is coming towards you. She's walking towards you and she has a container of food and drink for you. So tell her when she comes here that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving salam to her. And Jibreel is giving salam to her. This is the virtue that this woman had for her support, for her piety, in support of objective standards of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A lot of women today unfortunately have this misconception that Khadija radiallahu anha and her virtue was tied to, for example, her money or her quote-unquote business, in order to justify careers or living a life outside of their home, outside of focusing on their family, outside of basically spreading the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and supporting the initiatives for that. What they don't realize is her true virtue was actually in this. She's not remembered for her money. She's remembered for her support of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is the same woman who prior to the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam getting revelation, when he was spending weeks in Jabal al-Nur, in Ghar Hira, he was spending days and weeks there contemplating prior to revelation. This woman would actually walk all the way from Mecca, close to the Kaaba, all the way up to the mountain. And anybody who's been to Mecca can really see what that distance looks like. It's tremendous. And then she would walk all the way up on Jabal al-Nur to give him his provisions, while having basically time dedicated towards raising children like Fatima, the ones who ended up becoming the mothers to one of the greatest children, the leaders of the youth in paradise, Hassan and Hussein. None of this happens arbitrarily. This happens when you basically systematically transfer wisdom and knowledge from one generation to another. You live an example of piety for the generations to come. And subhanAllah, you see the benefit of knowledge as well. You see the benefit of knowledge. Just like, for example, the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam dedicated one day in the week to the halaqah for women specifically to teach them. There's a hadith that basically shows a very important benefit from that. And one of the women from that particular halaqah mentions that once during one of the lessons that were being given by the Prophet ﷺ, a woman who had 3 children. She had 3 children, but all of them unfortunately had passed away. A tremendous calamity. 3 children, all of them had died. So this woman asked the Messenger ﷺ, or rather the Rasul ﷺ actually mentioned, that a woman whose 3 children have died will be shielded from the punishment of the fire by virtue of the trials and tribulations that she had faced in the death of her children. So one of the women who were present in the halaqah basically asked, what about if I had 2 children who passed away? The Rasul ﷺ gave the same bashara to her as well, that yes, you'll be protected from the fire as well. This comes from knowledge. Now imagine if a woman was facing a trial, a tribulation in life that is significant as losing all of our children. This is the understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah that serves as vitamins and minerals for patience, for tawakkul. This is what we need to continue strengthening our iman and our actions despite the trials and tribulations that come to us. This comes from knowledge. This is not something arbitrary. Similarly, you have other examples that we can draw as well. One of the most common problems that a lot of women complain about today is struggling with, for example, modesty, struggling with their hijab, their 𝗪𝗵𝗿𝗲, their abaya. They find it difficult to conform when the society that they're living in currently does the exact opposite. The issue is not actually related to the hijab. The issue is not the issue of abaya or modesty. The issue is that there's a weak link between the heart and with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So once we understand the true cause for these difficulties, then we can basically start patching it up. Then we can basically start to rectify these sources of weaknesses and then to gain the strength that is necessary to achieve a lot. Because there are lots of women who cannot be bought even with $1 million. You can give them $1 million and tell them to go and remove this article of clothing and you'll make a lot of money. They will say no. Because they have a strong connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's as if they can see the paradise and hellfire in front of them. And they act accordingly because they want to protect themselves from the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, just upon this particular topic, how can we basically strengthen our connection related specifically to those women who are facing this challenge? The first thing, or the first step, is to understand that it's okay to have weaknesses. It's okay to have certain weaknesses in our faith, in our action, in our spiritual state, in our emotional state. It's okay to have weaknesses. This is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. Allah created us with certain weaknesses in order to test us. So some of those weaknesses are general, such as, for example, the love of the dunya. This is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed in the hearts of pretty much all of the human beings in general. But then you also have certain specific weaknesses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests us with as well. That could be, for example, modesty. It could be a loose tongue. It could be difficulties in, for example, how we express ourselves, how we conduct ourselves. Everybody has their own unique weaknesses to basically overcome. So the first thing is to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us weak. And that is by design, in order to test us, to see how effectively can we mend ourselves. We're like a broken piece of glass. This dunya is designed to break us, basically. So that we can basically show Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is how we took all of the pieces up and joined it together as best as we can. That's the first step. The second step is to remind ourselves that we are, at the end of the day, the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the moment we basically truly believe that we are the property of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we didn't create our bodies, we didn't create our minds, we didn't create our hearts that serve as vessels for iman. All of this is Allah's. We are the properties of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all of us. And this is in direct refutation of a lot of feminists, for example, who will say, this is my body, I can do whatever I want. We are the properties of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The moment we truly internalize what that means, then it becomes easy. The steps afterwards become very easy for us to basically now learn what is the standard of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then to give in. And that's what submission is. وَيُسَلِّمُ تَسْلِيمًا, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed as a condition of our faith, to submit. The next step will be to remind ourselves of the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is paradise. Because human beings by design need an end goal. We can't function without seeing what the end result is, what the reward is. Again, all of this is tied to piety. All of this is tied to seeking knowledge. And then eventually with the intention of applying it as well. And the last step in order to strengthen our connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to surround ourselves with righteous people as well. If you're in an environment of piety, if, for example, the sisters are in an environment where modesty is common, where instead of gossiping and backbiting, you have women reminding each other of what to do in order to seek closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it becomes naturally easy to conform to that. You no longer have to be pulled back down, which is very common to see among women who are the exact opposite of that. All of that pursuit of piety, basically, through knowledge, is meant so that we can basically apply it in our actions. And that is the second step of piety: knowledge and application. In terms of action, it is absolutely essential for a woman who's righteous, to understand and then pray, fast, do all of the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, give her zakat, perform her hajj, her umrah, and then to benefit from all of the aspects of interactions that she's able to learn from many sources that are credible, from the masjid and outside of it. She's also a woman who's tied to the community as well. Yes, there's an emphasis on family, but she's also tied to the overall community as well. Meaning she attends the masjid as much as possible in order to benefit from it as well. Now obviously there are conditions for when it is permissible for a woman to come to the masjid as well. There are certain situations when, if it's violated, then she cannot enter the masjid. Like for example, if she's in her state of menses or in a state of postpartum bleeding, she cannot come to the masjid for a long period of time. She can basically come in and out to pick certain things up for a short period of time, but she cannot stay for a long period of time in that state. Similarly, if she's coming to the masjid, she should not adorn herself or wear any kind of perfume. That is absolutely prohibited in the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Similarly, you have other situations where if a woman has other obligations at home, like for example, she has an infant at home to take care of, then it is better for her to basically stay at home to fulfill that obligation as opposed to come to the masjid. Unless if it's a one-off event, for example, or something to benefit from, where she can bring them as well without causing any kind of harm to them, or to neglect any kind of obligation towards them. Also, if there's any kind of harm that is possible to come upon a woman in coming to the masjid, then she should not be doing that as well. It is better for her to stay at home. But in general, there is a tremendous amount of benefit to be had from the halaqat and from the programs in the masjid. Not just from a knowledge perspective, but also from the perspective of making connections. How else or where else are you going to find other righteous practicing women to be with than the masjid? The masjid is from the epicenter of righteousness in a particular community. Similarly, you also have other aspects of application of piety as well, which is to not let emotions overrule the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made, out of His wisdom, women as more emotional as opposed to rational. So to continue, we were mentioning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created men with a certain strength in one quality, which is rationality, and women to excel in another sphere of qualities, which is basically emotions. Both of them play a very pivotal role in fulfilling the complementary roles that we spoke about in the beginning of the halaqah. Now, the challenge for women would be in this case to not let their emotions overrule above the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we see this, for example, in the ayah, one of the greatest ayat in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ahzab, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ وَمَنْ يَعْصِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ فَقَدْ ضَلَّ ضَلَالًا مُبِينًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in describing the believers, both the males and the females, He says that it is not befitting for them to have a say after the command, the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger has been given. This is from the essence of belief for both the males and the females. When we look at this particular ayah and the context in which it was revealed in, we see the story of Zaynab bin Jahsh and her brother Abdullah bin Jahsh radiyallahu anhuma. Zaynab bin Jahsh was basically later on the mother of the believers. At this particular stage, before this ayah was revealed, the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam actually proposed marriage on behalf of his adopted son, Zayd ibn Haritha, for him to marry Zaynab bin Jahsh. Now, Zaynab bin Jahsh is basically from one of the best lineages and one of the best families in Quraysh. Whereas Zayd ibn Haritha was actually a freed slave. So, in order to basically eliminate the social norms of the past in Jahiliyyah, he told Zayd ibn Haritha basically to propose marriage to Zaynab. Now, because of this social statuses and the difference in them between the two families, Zaynab bin Jahsh and Abdullah bin Jahsh, her brother, flat out said no. They said no, we're not going to do it. And there was an active resistance from their side because they did not want basically this woman of a certain caliber, lineage and background and family to basically come and marry Zayd ibn Haritha. This is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed this particular ayah. That it is not befitting for a believer when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger have given a particular command, a judgment, to have any say above that. When this ayah was revealed, Zaynab bin Jahsh basically accepted. Even though her emotions, her inclination was contrary, but because the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the one who said this, and the confirmation came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they gave in. This is what submission looks like. This is true piety. This is basically how the believing male and the female is supposed to be. And this is the first major quality of femininity and womanhood. This is what a righteous woman is. Now, the benefit, we'll finish the piety section with some of the benefits of that. So what does a pious woman get? The pious woman, in short, gets exactly what the pious man gets. So in this aspect, there's absolute equality between men and women. So even though functionally we're different, there are many elements that are actually the exact same between a man and a woman. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the famous ayah in Surah Al-Ahzab, He mentions this. إِنَّ الْمُسْلِمِينَ وَالْمُسْلِمَاتِ وَالْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ وَالْقَانِتِينَ وَالْقَانِتَاتِ وَالصَّادِقِينَ وَالصَّادِقَاتِ وَالصَّابِرِينَ وَالصَّابِرَاتِ وَالْخَاشِعِينَ وَالْخَاشِعَاتِ وَالْمُتَصَدِّقِينَ وَالْمُتَصَدِّقَاتِ وَالصَّائِمِينَ وَالصَّائِمَاتِ وَالْحَافِظِينَ فُرُوجَهُمْ وَالْحَافِظَاتِ وَالذَّاكِرِينَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا وَالذَّاكِرَاتِ أَعَدَّ اللَّهُ لَهُمْ مَغْفِرَةً وَأَجْرًا عَظِيمًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this long ayah mentions that indeed the Muslim man and the Muslim woman, the believing man and the believing woman, the obedient man and the obedient woman, the truthful man and the truthful woman, the patient man and the patient woman, the humble man and the humble woman, the charitable man and the charitable woman, the fasting man and the fasting woman, the man or the men who guard their private parts and the women who also guard their private parts, and the men who remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala much and the women who remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala much. For them Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. This is basically the first benefit of piety. The reward which is basically shared among humanity. And obviously, as we discuss in the definition of piety, the protection from the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second aspect, and which is something that is very heavily tied to the discussion on feminism that we had in the beginning, is that piety through knowledge and application has the benefit of protection from one of the greatest fitan that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has subjected humanity to. Who can guess what that fitna is? And this is something that is very relevant to women in particular. Which fitna is piety serving as a protective mechanism against? And this is perhaps the greatest fitna that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will subject humanity to. Who knows what that fitna is? Can anybody guess? Chastity is a fitna, no doubt, but that's not the greatest, or from the greatest of fitan for humanity. Dajjal. Dajjal is from the greatest of fitan. And this is relevant here because of the hadith of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam that was narrated by the companion Abdullah ibn Umar radiyallahu anhuma, who said that the Messenger said sallallahu alaihi wasallam that the false Messiah, al-Masih al-Dajjal, this is the great, the false Messiah, will come upon a land that he described as a very low land, Marriqanat, as the hadith mentions. And he says something that is very startling. And he says that most of those who will go out to him answering his call are going to be women. And it will be until a man goes back to his home, to his wife, to his mother, to his daughter, to his sister, and to his aunt, to shackle them tightly, fearing that they will basically go out to him. This is a hadith that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, and Imam Ahmad collected it in his Musnad. Meaning that this is going to be a tremendous fitna for women in particular. A fitna that is all for humanity, but there will be a large portion of women who will actually end up falling into that trap that will be set by the false Messiah. And as other narrations mention, that the one who is able to distinguish between the lies of Al-Masih al-Dajjal are going to be those individuals who have a very particular quality known as basira. They have insight. Because the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentions that Dajjal will have something written on his forehead. It will be written kafir, kafara. Meaning that even though it's something that is clear cut, the signs are clear, but there will be still a large portion of people who will basically fall into that trap, and they will follow this particular individual that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created as a title. And even though he has kafara written on his forehead, the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that only the believer will be able to see it and read it, even if they are illiterate. Meaning the element that will allow us to basically distinguish between truth and falsehood, especially in the time of the false Messiah, is going to be belief, iman. Iman which comes to us with knowledge, and iman that is lived. So this is it's a very startling and very important warning, really, to all of humanity, but in women in particular, that we have to basically, especially when you see all of the signs, ashrat as-sa'a, the signs of the hour are manifesting quicker and quicker and quicker and quicker. Meaning that the time of the false Messiah is not too far off. And in order to have protection against that level of trial and that level of a tribulation that will come, we have to either, prepare, not either, but we have to prepare ourselves in this generation. And then even if we miss it in our lifetime, our progeny should be preparing for that as well. And that basira comes from the Quran and the Sunnah and its application. So this is a very, very important element. Piety, especially for women, it will allow them to protect against the influences that are rampant. In fact, feminism, according to many of the modern contemporary ulama, they actually apply this particular hadith, some of them, to the feminist movement. That this is just a precursor to the real call of Dajjal that will come to them. And look at how many women, for example, today are fighting for this ideology. An ideology that is antithetical to Islamic values. This is a sign that there is a lack of insight, a lack of basira in the ummah. The second broad quality that we will discuss inshallah is the embodiment and pursuing excellence in a very specific quality, and that is the quality of haya. Haya. Haya, which is defined as basically shame, modesty, bashfulness, and being conscientious in both in your thoughts and in your actions, so that it can prevent a woman, or for that matter even a man, because this quality is very essential for both genders as well, so that it can prevent a person from crossing a boundary of indecency or immorality. This is what basically haya is. It is basically the mechanism that protects our honor. And it's not something that is considered as a bad thing. By the way, shyness and bashfulness, especially in the Western culture today, is seen as something that is bad. Like it is celebrated for a person to be, very outspoken and loud and expressive with their opinions and this and that. Rather, the standard of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the exact opposite in this. Especially women, are meant to be individuals who embody haya, and we will discuss some examples of what that actually looks like. Now, linguistically, the word haya, and it is very important to understand these elements because it really helps put matters in perspective when we understand these deeper details. Haya comes from basically the word hayat, life itself, because the Arabs considered people's life or them being alive with the quality of modesty. Life and modesty were basically proportionate to them. This is why basically the same word or similar word is chosen in this particular context. The living essentially have a natural sense of guilt to protect them against having their honor basically taken away. And this is why, for example, when you see janazah, those who basically process a janazah, they give the ghusl to the mayyit, to the deceased person. From the conditions of a person who's allowed to do that is that they have to be trustworthy. Why? Because the one who's dead, the one who's deceased now, they can no longer protect their honor. It is upon the one who's actually basically looking at them and taking care of them in the most vulnerable moment in their existence, in this dunya, after they've died. So they have to basically embody a level of trustworthiness for this reason, to maintain modesty, to maintain haya. And subhanAllah, when we see the examples of our salaf, starting from the Sahaba, we look at the example of Fatima bint Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. One of the things that she used to worry about with regards to death was that the kafan, the shroud, is basically something that is very tight. It's tightly wrapped around the body. So she had this concern even when she was alive, that how is it possible for her to basically be in a coffin after she has passed away? And it is in a tightly wrapped cloth, to the point that her outline, the body's outline is basically exposed. So she had a discussion with another woman named Ja'far. Ja'far basically told her that there's a solution to that. The solution is basically after the coffin, we put a little bit of dried palm leaves, and then on top of that, we put another layer of cloth. And this basically covers everything. Fatima radiallahu anha was so pleased with that she basically appointed this woman, Ja'far, and her husband Ali to be the ones who basically wash her body after that. This was one of her wishes. And according to some of the other historians, she also wished to be buried in the nighttime in order to protect her modesty even after her soul has been taken away from her body. This is a level of modesty that they had. When similarly you have other examples of the likes of Aisha. Aisha, in her room, the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam is buried. And then beside him is Abu Bakr, who's buried, her father. And then beside him is Umar. After Umar radiallahu anhu was buried also in her room, That was the point, because he was a non-mahram to her, as opposed to the other two. After Umar was buried in her room, she no longer basically felt comfortable taking off her khimar, her abaya. Her modesty was basically as if basically a living non-mahram was there. This is the level of modesty that basically they embodied, and this is something that is a great quality to have, because even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is haya. There's a beautiful narration of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam where he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala feels haya. He feels a sense of modesty and shame when a man raises, or a woman as an extension as well, raises their hands to him asking for something, and he doesn't return anything back, or he basically lets them go empty-handed and disappointed. Allah even feels this quality of haya in a manner that befits His Majesty, of course. But this is to emphasize this crucial quality of haya. Haya is something that it's like life. If a person does not have haya, it's as if they're dead. And this is the reason why the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam also mentions that haya is from the branches of iman. And he said that if, let's say, a person has his haya leave him, basically, his haya is gone, then he can do whatever you want. Let him do whatever you want. Because there's nothing basically protecting his sense of guilt anymore. Now, how do we apply it? Let's give one of the best examples that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given in the Quran. Allah actually mentions the quality of haya in a woman in the Quran. Who knows the example of that? Who knows what I'm referring to? From one of the stories of the Quran. Maryam alayhi salam, no, that would be incorrect. Yes, Musa alayhi salam, in what story? When two sisters were asking him for help. Beautiful. So Musa alayhi salam, after he had fled Egypt, he went to a land and he was exhausted in that state, having basically run out of Egypt to protect himself. And he came across basically a well which was surrounded by shepherds who were feeding their own flock. And they were very rough and tough, and they weren't very righteous people, basically. They were hoarding the well. And he saw a couple of women standing with their flock, because their father was too old to basically do this job of feeding their animals. So now the two daughters basically were there, but because they saw the men hoarding the wealth in a very unjust and in a manner that basically lacks chivalry, they were just waiting on the side. Musa alayhi salam sees this particular scene, and he chooses to basically go and help them in that kind of a state. He basically takes their flock, goes to the well, gets the water out, and gives it to them so that they can basically feed their flock. Then after that, the two women go back to their father and they relate to them the story of what just happened. They found an amazing, righteous man, basically, who helped them out. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَجَاءَتْهُ إِحْدَاهُمَا تَمْشِي عَلَى اسْتِحْيَاءٍ. One of those two women, basically the father told them to go back to that man. And look at how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala captures this particular detail. It amazes the mind, subhanAllah, that you have this valuable real estate in the Quran. 604 pages that are meant to be guidance for all of humanity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to capture this one particular quality. That one of those two women came back to Musa alayhi salam and they had haya. They came back with haya. They walked, the way she was walking, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala records that in the Quran. As an example for what a righteous woman is like, especially when she's surrounded by a non-mahram man. This is a very important quality. As opposed to, for example, like we mentioned, a very outspoken in public, loud and brash. This is not something that is a quality of righteousness in a woman in particular. A woman is basic, is awrah. Awrah is a concept that is to conceal, is to protect. Anything of value, normally, is it out there in the open or is it hidden? It's naturally hidden. This is basically what it is. This is the concept of Haya. Haya ensures protection. It ensures the protection of the woman, not just from other men, but also from other women as well. When a woman embodies Haya and they protect their modesty, one of the things that it does is that it protects other women as well and their own self-esteem. One of the biggest calamities that we see today in the age of social media is that you have women who are basically openly displaying their beauty in exchange for money and fame, to the point where it's causing havoc with other women. They end up comparing themselves. They have alarming rates of body dysmorphia. And according to recent stats, even the men have very similar rates of body dysmorphia as well, because we're being subjected to the same standards of quote-unquote perfection as determined by whatever corporation that is paying them. Modesty protects them as well, their own self-esteem. And it also protects them from those men who are willing and capable of transgressing certain bounds as well. ذَلِكَ أَدْنَى أَن يُعْرَفْنَ فَلَا يُؤْذَيْنَ. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded and obligated the jilbab, the outermost garment that covers them from basically their shoulders all the way down to their feet, in conjunction or in combination with the khimar that covers their head until their chest. One of the reasons why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this as an obligation is so that they will be known as women of honor, and so that they won't be abused. They won't be harassed. This is meant to protect them as well. And also this is meant, modesty in that context is also meant to protect men as well. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created men with this particular weakness. And as we have mentioned in the prior halaqat, men and women are allies of one another. Just like men are supposed to basically be the qawwam in order to protect women so that they can do their job. Similarly, women are also meant to do or act in particular ways in order to protect the weaknesses of men. This is what alliance looks like. This is basically what the West tries to completely destroy, so that men and women are pitted against one another. It's standard divide and conquer. That's what we're trying to avoid here. So it protects men as well in that particular situation. This is basically the quality of Haya. Now obviously there are some instances in which Haya is actually counterproductive. It shouldn't be there. One of those examples as an exception is in seeking knowledge. In seeking knowledge, as one of the Salaf, one of the Tabi'een, Mujahid ibn Jabr, he said that two things prevent a person from seeking knowledge. One is Haya, shyness, and the second is kibr, arrogance. Two things that basically prevent a person from attaining knowledge. And this it's important to understand these qualities, because you have to know when to apply them and when not to apply them. There are plenty of examples of women among the Sahaba, the Sahabiyat, where they would come to the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and discuss and ask him questions that were important, even though they were very personal to them. Women basically asking about what is the ruling on a wet dream. Something that is very personal to them, but they did not have a sense of Haya to the extent that it prevented them from knowing the truth from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why Aisha radiallahu anha, she has a statement praising the women of the Ansar. She said that how excellent are the women of the Ansar. They do not allow shyness to prevent them from understanding the deen. And this is basically when she saw the women of the Ansar boldly coming, for example, asking about matters or rulings pertaining to menses. You had, for example, women sending their sanitary cloths with discharge on them in a box, and they would send it to the house of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam with Aisha and Salam and other women of knowledge in order to seek the ruling. Is this something related to menses or not? What is the ruling on this? Is she supposed to pray now or not? And so on and so forth. Deep personal issues. But there's no Haya when it comes to seeking the knowledge of this deen. Do not ever prevent yourself from knowing the truth, whether it's in Aqeedah, whether it's in tawheed, whether it's in fiqh. Seek the knowledge right away. Do not delay these matters at all. Now, the third quality that we'll discuss, and we'll end with this inshallah, and we'll have a short Q&A after as well, is the importance that they place towards family and home life. This is the third broad category of a righteous woman, that they place as number one priority functionally their family and their home life. They actually desire marriage. They want to have a family. They want children. They want to basically protect their chastity in the bond of marriage. That's why the Rasul ﷺ in the famous hadith basically says to the women and their walis, that if a man comes to you and he has deen and akhlaq, then marry him. And if they don't, إِلَّا تَفْعَلُوهُ تَكُنْ فِتْنَةٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَفَسَادٌ عَرِيضٌ. If they don't do that, then there will be a tremendous, a widespread trial and corruption on this earth. Marriage and desiring marriage and actually getting married and being in the bond of marriage is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended for us to be. And the protection of fertility, the protection of that desire to have children is something that comes from the sunnah of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He's the one who says, he's the one who recommended the men, go and marry women who are loving and fertile, because he wants to see a large number of his followers on the Day of Judgment. He encouraged us to have children, not just for the sake of having children, but also to teach them about tawheed, teach them about the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that they're assets to the ummah. They're assets to the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. This is antithetical to basically what we're seeing today. We're seeing a delay. A lot of women, unfortunately, are delaying marriage. They're delaying having children to the detriment of their chastity, to the detriment of their own fertility. Why? Because they want a career, they want an extra business, they want to travel the world, they want another second or third degree. This is something that is not enjoined by the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are conditions in which it becomes permissible for a woman to work and be part of those kinds of activities, but it should never come at the detriment or to the delay of their family life. Family life is basically it needs to be their number one functional priority. And then similarly, you have a desire to be at the service of the family as well. It's not enough to basically just get married and then live basically in independent, with an independent mindset. No, there has to be a desire to develop your family, to be an asset to your family, to desire the best of the children to come out in terms of our progeny. If you look at the four of the greatest women, we discussed some of those details already. The four greatest women, what are they known for? Khadija radiallahu anha, as we discussed, known for her support of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If you look at Fatima, she's known for supporting the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. She's the one who's basically picking up the entrails of the camel when the Quraysh dropped it while the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was in sujood. She was the one running and basically cleaning it up. This is the woman who's known for supporting her husband Ali radiallahu anhu. He was one of the greatest supports for the da'wah. We owe our Islam and the spread of Islam to these individuals. She's known for producing two of the leaders of the youth among the people of paradise, Hassan and Hussein. This is what they're known for. Asiya, known for supporting and building Musa alayhi salam. Maryam, salamun alayha, known for building one of the greatest anbiya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Isa. This is what they're known for. At the end of the day, nobody's going to remember you for your money. Nobody's going to remember you for your career or your business. They're going to remember you for what legacy you have left behind of righteousness. And anything that you leave behind of righteousness, it will continue to benefit you in your graves until the Day of Judgment. This is basically the summary of the three major qualities, and much more can be said, subhanAllah, but because of time we'll summarize. We mentioned the hadith of, or the athar of Umar radiallahu anh last time in the lecture of manhood and masculinity, where he described the qualities of 3 men and 3 women. So we covered basically half the hadith as a summary. We'll cover the full hadith today. So Umar bin Khattab, and this is narrated by Imam al-Bayhaqi in his book 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲, where he says that there are 3 types of men and 3 types of women. As for the men, the first is a chaste, easy, gentle man who possesses opinion and insight of his own and is worthy of being consulted. And when a matter comes to him, he basically follows his insight, he follows his knowledge and approaches the matter as it should be. That's the first type of man. The second man is a man who has no opinion of his own. But when a matter comes to him, he goes to the man of the first category and actually seeks his opinion. So he's a man who basically, he's not perfect in his knowledge, but when a matter comes to him, he goes and seeks the knowledge so that he's upon the truth. And then the third type of man is basically somebody who is aimless, who has no guidance himself, and neither does he seek any guidance from other people. So he remains heedless. These are the 3 types of men that he described. Then he described 3 types of women. And he says, as for the women, then the first one is the one who's chaste, the one who's a Muslimah, the one who's gentle, loving, and a childbearing woman. And she helps her family in difficult situations and does not overburden them in times of difficulty. Meaning this is a woman who is a true asset to her family for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he mentions that rarely you will find such women. He actually mentions this. And this is the nature of a hierarchy, by the way. Whenever you have a hierarchy, usually the best of the best are few. So he says, rarely will you find such a woman. Then he says the second type of a woman is like a vessel. A vessel whose main job is to basically get married and have children, and then that's it. She's neither basically an asset nor is she a source of harm for the family. She's basically somebody who continues the lineage from one generation to another. And then he says the third type of a woman is one who's like a shackle. It's like a shackle that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts her around the neck of whomever He wills. And when He wills, He removes it. So 3 types of men and 3 types of women. The best, the average, and then the sinful, basically the destructive form of a man and a woman. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to take heed from these messages, from the guidance of the Quran and the Sunnah, and how the Salaf al-Salihin basically lived their life and embodied these essential qualities. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us among the best of the men and the best of the women. And to protect us from the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this life and in the next. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to gather together in paradise, similar to how He has gathered us together in this dunya as allies of one another for His sake and His sake only. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen.